Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Notes and Quotes podcast. Today is a special day because we've got a guest today. I love having guests on the podcast. It's such an honor to have people join this community with me and share conversations with you. So, today we're talking to Abbie Wolfe. They're a Manchester based queer rights activist and community organiser and the Secretary of Trans Mutual Aid Manchester. They've worked across the spectrum of organizations from large NGOs to tiny grassroots teams, spending every day to try and make the world a tiny bit better. Their background is in history and sociology, and they revel in getting to be one of the many millions of pairs of hands across the ages, bending the long arc of history towards justice. Guys, I'm so excited to talk to Abbie. This is going to be a really great conversation, and I'm so glad that you're here to experience it. Okay, let's go talk to Abbie. I'm going to stop talking so that we can hear from them. Okay, bye. Okay, hi, Abbie. How are you doing today? Thanks so much for coming on.
Very well, thank you. Bit warmer than I'd like, but we're doing fine nonetheless.
Yeah, no, we're definitely into the summer weather now. I'm loving it and I'm hating it at the same time because when it gets past 25 is when I start to get miserable, but below 25 I'm okay. I'm like in happy mood. So with every episode that we do, we always have the guest choose a quote of the day. Usually sometimes if it's just me talking, then I get to do the quote of the day. But when it's a guest on, I feel like I want to hand that over to them. So, what's your quote for today?
So today I'm going to be sharing a quote from one of my absolute activist icons, Grace Lee Boggs, in her fairly seminal work, The Next American Revolution. I actually mostly came across her work in terms of a number of essays she did back in the 70s and 80s, but finally got down to reading some of her books. And the quote I'd like to share is, "We are beginning to understand that the world is always being made fresh and never finished."
Hmm. I actually really love that quote. I think it's a thinker, isn't it? It's not one of those because when I look at quotes, I am always privy to the ones that make you read it a second time. The quotes like just do it or live in the moment or something, I just find really trivial and annoying to look at. But these kinds of quotes where it really makes you think about your reality and the way of the world really interests me. Why do you think that this is a quote that resonates with you?
So in the most specific case, it's very much, she goes on to talk about how activism kind of gets very much tied up in this idea of the destination. We're looking at, the big change.
Mm,
So much of the history of activism, the history of development of civil rights and human rights is kind of framed as these big landmark pieces of legislation or big political decisions when
yeah.
realistically activism is a journey, and that's how Grace Lee Boggs describes it. And it's this idea that it's not about achieving this individual set goal, it's about a continuous progress of evolution that is sometimes messy, sometimes invisible, sometimes takes, two steps backwards to get one step forwards, but is always happening quietly, consistently, and continually in the background in every corner of the world.
Yeah, I actually really agree with that. I think that's a very lovely way to look at it because even beyond activism, just people in general tend to have this goal mindset where they have one specific idea of how an outcome should be. So if you're an activist and you're fighting for climate change, you're envisioning a totally green net zero world. If you are, fighting for black rights, you're imagining a completely, racially bias free reality, but it doesn't always go in the exact kinds of steps that we are hoping for to get to that one vision. And it's great to have a vision. It's great to have, a point of focus. But I think what you were expressing, the whole being open to the evolution of it and being open to the fact that things are going to change. You're going to take, like you said, two steps forward, two steps backwards to have one step forward is really valuable in making you want to keep moving forward, knowing that it's not going to go as perfectly as you expect it to be. So I think that's a really, really interesting quote that you've shared with us today. I've had my own journey with anxiety and other mental health struggles, and one of the things that did help was therapy. Even though I didn't go consistently, those few sessions definitely made a big difference. To be honest, the first time that I went, I had no idea what to expect. I was definitely nervous sitting across from a total stranger who I was supposed to open up to about a bunch of personal stuff. There were a lot of awkward silences, and I left feeling like maybe therapy just wasn't for me. What I didn't know then was finding the right therapist can take time, and on top of that, it can even be really hard to get an appointment in the first place. That's why I'm genuinely excited that BetterHelp is the paid partner of this episode. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. It's an online platform where you can match with a credentialed therapist based on your needs and talk to them in a way that works best for you, whether that's video, phone, or even text. There's also a journaling feature inside the platform if writing things down helps you process. And there's daily group sessions on a variety of topics, so you don't have to go it alone if you don't want to. The best part is if your first therapist doesn't feel like the right fit, switching is super easy so you can find someone you truly connect with. BetterHelp carefully makes sure therapists on the platform are well qualified, and their customer support team is there to help you if you have any questions. With over 7,000 reviews and a 5.5-star rating on Trustpilot, it's a platform you can trust. If you're struggling and think you'd benefit from a therapy session, go to betterhelp.com/notes and quotes or choose Notes and Quotes podcast during your sign up and get 10% off your first month of therapy. This could be something that really helps you. Now, back to the episode. What do you think is something that people often assume about your set of activism that's just not true? Because you yourself are an activist, aren't you?
I have been labelled as such by people in various states. Yes. Yeah. It's kind of I almost shrug sometimes at the term activist in that, and it's going to awfully getting into awfully pretentious territory, but I kind of feel, anybody who is helping in their community is an activist. Anybody who, cares about the world, anybody who goes up and picks a piece of litter up off the street or, goes and gives £5 to a charity or something is doing activism of some scale or other. And it's
Yeah.
just, at what necessary scale do you become a capital A activist? I don't think there's a line. I think it is activism is wanting the world to be better. And honestly, I think the amount of people who don't want the world to be different than they find it is perishingly small. We
Mm.
can argue all day with various people about what better necessarily is, and we certainly have those arguments. But I don't think there's anybody who isn't trying to affect positive change in their world to some degree or other.
Yeah, I actually think that's really true because I've always struggled with identifying as an activist as well because in my past I've done little bits of climate activism and done, the typical conferences and big meetings and whatever that kind of classifies you as an activist. But whenever I'm not doing those kinds of things and I'm just doing exactly what you said, the everyday stuff, it feels hard to call myself an activist because there is kind of this carbon copy label or box of what it kind of is to be an activist and what it is to truly be fighting for change. And I feel like it's almost more impactful to just be the person doing the everyday stuff to leave the world in a better place than you found it. And it can be really sad to look at the, like you said, the small number of people who just don't want to make a change. And it makes me wonder, why do you think there's such an aversion to changing what we currently have in our world, changing how the world is, whatever it is, whatever community you're in, whatever problems you see, and you just there's a kind of an apathy that people have to the way things are.
I mean, some of it comes down to people are used to what they're used to. People who have grown up their entire lives in a way of being, like I remember I had some conversations with some colleagues about this when the Queen died, 4 or 5 years back or whenever that was now. Um, and it was kind of like, this is amongst a group who I think could be easily described as pretty radically anti-monarchist, but there was still a wealth of feelings there because it was something that literally everybody in the room had grown up with. It had been their entire
Yeah.
lives. I've got had activists in there who were in their 50s who, were like had grown up with the Queen being a fundamental presence in their lives. And it's even if these things that you kind of, in your gut politically oppose, the ideas of, monarchy and divine right of kings and so forth, you can still kind of get this idea of, well, this is just the way it's always been. And I think that's a
Mm.
very difficult notion for people to get over, because human lives are pretty short. In the span of the cosmos, or the geological age of the Earth, the maybe 80, 90, if we're on a good run, years that we get, is not very much. And it's
Yeah.
very easy to kind of get into this idea that the way that you found the Earth is the way it's always been and will always be, because in your tiny little frame, not much has changed. And I think this is, again, it's coming back to the quote of Grace Lee Boggs there, everything is always being made fresh, is that actually tremendous change happens. I have the benefit of being, I'm going to say, brought up as a historian. I have very little academic qualification, but that's not really stopped me so far. We see these complete fundamental sweeping changes, but in the tiny snapshot of one human life, it doesn't seem like a lot. And I think the other side of it is instability. People are inherently worried about their lives, their livelihoods, the livelihoods of their children, their communities, and I think we've kind of gained a little bit of, perhaps complacency isn't quite the right word, but we've kind of forgotten how rapidly things can change, and not for the better.
Hmm.
My grandfather was in World War II. The generation before him was, in the seminal conflict, the most devastating war in Western Europe's history. And they saw change in such a sweeping fashion that we've kind of forgotten that, the world can turn on a dime sometimes.
Yeah.
So you've got these kind of conflicting ideas of, oh, well, nothing ever changes, but everything could change really badly, really quickly. And I think most people are kind of stuck between these two poles of, I don't want things to go badly, but I also don't think they can really change for the better. And in that state, can you really blame people for feeling that there's not much chance of improving the world?
Yeah. It kind of, when you say that, it kind of makes me think it's either people are stuck in either comfort or fear. Like they're too comfortable to want to change because it's in their mind, like you said, it's always been this way. Or they're too scared because of the impending doom and how big the issues seem that they can't really do much about it. And you said earlier that you didn't have that many educational qualifications, which shocks me as well because you sound very educated and you sound like really eloquent and like you have so much knowledge with you to share. And it also makes me wonder kind of what took you into this path of into the quote unquote activism or trying to make change in the world sphere because you've also done a lot with organizations like Transmutual Aid for that does a lot of really good for a sector of humanity that struggles quite a lot and tends to be overlooked and needs more support, I think.
I mean, I have the distinction of being both a senior school and a sixth form college dropout, and that's the highest levels of academic achievement I've ever achieved. To throw another quote into the notes and quotes episode, I've never allowed schooling to get in the way of me education, to quote Mark Twain. Um, as to what got me into it, I would probably have to put an awful lot of it down to a black ex-former bin man from Moss Side in Manchester, who at one time was my sociology teacher at that sixth form college that I only lasted a year at, who very much an old style trade union activist, and he very much kind of saw an angry young kid who was very much suffering the world's abuses, but didn't know what was causing it or why it was happening, and kind of sat me down and said, "Here's the way of the world, kid." And I was like, "Ah, that explains a lot." And I've been doing my best to try and address some of it in the small ways that we do ever since. As to how much difference I've made, it's incalculable. You can never really know. And I think that's kind of one of the, as again, the ideas of what an activist is. It's somebody making the world better. And I don't think anyone ever really knows how much of an impact they've ever had.
Yeah. Which I don't know if it's right to say that I struggle with. Like, I'm not sure what the right way to say it is, or the right term, but it can be kind of sad to think that, you know, activists or people who are trying to change the world are they care so passionately about the issues that they're advocating for. They care so much about the things that they do in their everyday lives to try and make a better world, but you never really know how much of a difference you're making. And it always feels, what I think, like less than it actually is, because you not everybody that you've made a difference in or everybody that you've impacted is gonna come back to you and, give you this big testimony. That's I think 9 times out of 10 that's probably not gonna happen, because there could be a time where you go and drop a fiver in a donation bin and somebody else sees you do that and that inspires them to do it too, instead of just walking past it. But you're never going to know that. So it's not as tangible as saying, like, oh, I've impacted this many people. And sometimes when, you're working in organizations, or I don't know, working business or sales, it's really motivating to keep going on things that you're doing, because you can see actual numbers of, this is the concrete impact that I'm, making. And when you work in charities or you work in advocacy or something like that, it's a bit harder. So it's a lot of it is self motivation in a way, and also remembering why you got into it, which is why whenever I'm talking to people like yourself, I always ask, what is it that got you into it? Because I think that's kind of your compass as to why you keep doing what you're doing, whether it's because somebody, like who you just said, impacted you and took your life down a different path, or if it's because you were raised in a certain way, or if you saw a certain issue and just felt like you resonated with it. Stuff like that I think is worth sharing, because I would love a world where other people are motivated to do the same thing. Hey, I'm interrupting this episode briefly to talk to you about something that's actually quite cool. We've launched a special fundraiser in partnership with the British Red Cross. Now, this podcast is all about community, and for communities to thrive, we need to support each other. The British Red Cross supports millions of people in the UK and across the world get the support they need when the crisis strikes. Their Quest for Kindness campaign is all about helping people spread the word of kindness online and raise money for the world's emergency responders. From natural disasters to conflict zones, the Red Cross is there. And now we can be too. If you want to join the kindness movement, it's extremely easy. You can use the link in the show notes to head to our fundraising page to donate or take part in our fun community polls. Polls like, what's your mood today? Do you prefer a dog or a cat? Or what superpower would you choose? Every click and contribution helps support people in crisis around the world. Let's show the world what kindness and a little bit of fun can do. Thanks for listening. So, kind of changing tone a little bit here, there's definitely a lot of stigma that circulates around the trans community. I think that's no secret at all. What do you think are the core things that people really need to unlearn when it comes to just the trans community in general?
I'd almost kind of push back on that a little. I don't
Oh, really?
genuinely think there is as much stigma as people are told.
Really?
When like I just before coming on this podcast, I popped down to the corner shop and and spoke to the cashier there as I was buying some blums, and like she doesn't give a shit that I'm trans. Like
Yeah.
99% of the people I interact with in the day is just like, oh, it's just another person on the street. I'm getting on with my life. I
Mhm.
think the idea that we're kind of seen as this broad threat to society by many people is fundamentally wrong. Most people don't care. Of course, there is the 1% who very much care, but they really are a minority. The amounts of interactions I have of a day with people, and I'm a bit of an extrovert, so I'll go out and talk to people perhaps more than other people might. But even then, the amount of times where me being trans has come up in the interactions I have in a year is a tiny percentage. And I think, some of it comes back to the media. The media loves to say that, we're the big issue because, it's a
Mm,
billionaire owned media enterprise that, would very much like to not have to talk about, the actual economic issues and, wealth inequality and all the actual problems that we're facing in society.
yeah.
So, yeah, well, here we go. Here's a nice new scapegoat for everyone to be scared about. But aside from that, it really is just a very small minority of people. Of course, it's 1% of people are very much against us. I'd say probably few more than 1% are pretty supportive of us, and the vast majority of people don't really care one way or the other. Um, and that apathy can certainly have its problems when they are bombarded with media about the danger of trans people and so forth. But it
Mm,
kind of we're so caught up in the political moment as a concept, but it's kind of when you hear about political parties like Reform and the Republicans in the US and various other political movements across the world kind of make trans people out to be this huge big thing. But when we kind of see data coming back, when we see opinions coming back from people voting for these movements, trans people aren't in there. Like, they're not an issue that people are worried about day to day. People are worried about housing, they're worried about money, they're worried about the
yeah.
cost of living, they're worried about the literal, tangible things in their lives because of course they are. Like the fact that a trans person might exist somewhere isn't an issue to them, and nor should it be. They should
Mm.
definitely be concerned about the day to day problems. I will certainly disagree with many of these people on their suggested solutions to those problems, but yeah, I think it does come back to most people are happy for people to kind of get on with their lives, and I think that's the case more or less across the board for all matters of civil rights and human rights generally is most people are happy for people to get on and live their lives. It is a small, vociferous minority that very much has made part of their identity opposing certain classes of person, be it racialized minorities, gender minorities, sexual minorities, whatever it may be. Um, and there's certainly an absence of pushback against those people. But
Yeah.
on the whole, people are pretty disinterested is probably the most accurate way I can describe it. It's not, I wouldn't necessarily call it tolerance or acceptance, but people
Hmm.
are focused on their own lives. And
Yeah.
if that isn't impacted by somebody who's black or trans or gay or whatever it may be, they don't really care.
I'm actually, that's so interesting and really pleasing to hear actually, because I don't know. I think it is the media. I think it is the media because it's exactly what you said. There's this notion that the media pushes out, and the media has such a huge power on public perception, doesn't it? So we see this stuff happen, the constant conversation on the trans movement and trans people in the media makes it seem like it's such a pressing issue that so many people care about. So for someone like me who's, not really in the trans community, it's like I look at the media and then it tells you one thing and then you think, oh, this must be something that everybody cares about and this must be something that everyone's talking about. And in reality, that's not necessarily true. And it's really, really pleasing to hear that, it's not really much of a concern for people. And honestly, what you say makes complete sense because I think at the core, most people are more concerned with their own lives. They're concerned with cost of living. They're concerned with, are they going to be able to send their kids to school and, what the future is going to look like for them personally. So I think that's quite an interesting concept. And it also makes me think about, obviously it's not the same thing at all, but when I came to the UK, because I'm originally from Barbados, which is a predominantly black country. And when I came to the UK, in the media, when you're in Barbados, it it tells you about, all these racial things happening, which is not to say that they're not, they are happening, but it makes you think that they're happening on such a large scale. So when I first came to the UK, I was extremely wary of just anyone. Honestly, I was very hyper aware of my race and my nature as a minority. And even now, I mean, I live in a predominantly white area. I think yesterday, a black family moved in down the street, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, it's another black family!" And that's just like something that you see and you notice because you are a minority, and you'll notice somebody else that looks like you or identifies as you. So yeah, but when I was actually, a few months into living in the UK, I realized this is not as much as an issue as I thought. It actually was. People are really, really unconcerned with what I look like, or what race I am or anything. They don't really care unless you actually decide to go and, make a problem personally in their lives. Like if I go berate them or if I go, steal from them or something like that, then maybe they'll classify it to my race, but also unlikely. They'll be more concerned with the fact that this person has now impacted my life personally. But other than that, people are more concerned with their own personal lives. And that's quite an interesting thing. And it's interesting now to think about the impact that the media has on public perception and what we can do to kind of tell people that the reality is not necessarily what you're seeing in the media. And I wonder if that's why community and like connecting with people is so important offline. Have you ever found that, like the power of community or just the power of having others that you can relate to around you, or others that support you around you, so that you know that everything that you're seeing online is not necessarily the reality?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you are only getting your information through social media or billionaire owned, not that social media isn't billionaire owned, it very much is, but the sort of legacy media, with this oligopoly of a few different very wealthy companies that produce all of the content, and it's all filtered through this very Western, white, Eurocentric, well, European and American centric, capitalistic mindset, you are obviously going to get a very narrow idea of existence on this planet.
Yeah.
And since this is again the Notes and Quotes podcast, I will bring another quote.
More quotes.
That this was very much my runner up for Grace Lee Boggs for the quote, and I'm going to almost certainly get it wrong, so I'm pulling it from memory, but it was something to the lines of, um, "Change in the world has never been achieved through critical mass as much as through critical connections."
Oh wow.
And it's this idea that, yeah, you need to put people together. Humans are social animals. We problem solve, we think, we deal with things as communities, as groups. And it's this kind of pushback to this very individualistic, Western centric, media driven narrative that everything has to be the individuals. And this seeps into activism. I almost kind of wanted to pull it up earlier. You really hit the nail on the head when you were talking about kind of how in if you're working in business and when you're in a data driven kind of private enterprise, you can judge your effectiveness by the money's going up and your sales
Hmm.
commissions and things like this. And we're so kind of driven in our society to think of everything in this mindset, in this attempt to put a numerical value to everything. And there has to be the activist CEO,
Yeah.
and I kind of, I don't know if I actually coined the term. It's a term I use. I don't think I heard it from somewhere else, but I probably stole it off of somebody because plagiarism's not as fun as it used to be. Um, but this idea of entrepreneurial activism, of like,
Mm.
I should start a charity and I will be the big,
Yes.
icon. And we talk about, big icons like Greta Thunberg and so forth. And, she's doing fantastic work. Of course she is, but she's one person. And no activist movement is one person. And as much as we kind of lean on, I leaned on Grace Lee Boggs twice already as this icon activist, but she'd be the first to kind of stand up and say, is like, no, I was just a part of a movement.
Hmm.
Perhaps somebody who wrote down more things of that movement, perhaps spoke more publicly about that movement, but and similarly to myself, I'm represent different organizations and I often speak on those organizations' behalf, but there's a community there. It is a movement. It is a movement of individuals, and that's kind of what often gets lost in the narratives. And again, it's the media. Media wants to talk about, such and such a person is the activist in such and such a form of activism. This is the
Yeah.
queer activist. We want to talk about individuals because we live in a very individualistic driven society. We don't want to talk about class and race and gender and these big thorny sticky topics. And it's like, no, let's focus it all on an individual. And
Hmm.
it comes, it comes up in so many different ways. In popular culture, how often are we talking about some author or auteur, film director, or somebody has done something terrible and now we can't be involved in their project anymore or watch their media or whatever it is. It's always this focus on the individual and the individual's
Hmm.
conduct, and individuals don't change the world
Yeah.
realistically. you know all throughout history, even when we're talking about kings and generals and all this throughout great man theory of history, we know for a fact that no man rules alone, no man conquers alone. The idea that one person can completely shift the dial of a society is just patently false. We know that that just doesn't happen. Societies are groups of individuals, they are classes, they are social movements, they are political movements, and it's all social. It's all built on connections. It's all built on people coming together to change, to achieve things, to make the world a different place.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with that. I think that's a very insightful look onto the whole notion of community. It's We are all so interconnected is what I'm kind of taking from that on so many different levels. And the way that you explained that was brilliant. I thought I Because I find it very difficult sometimes to explain to people that level of interconnectivity, because once again, like you said, the media really does love a hero shot. They love to have somebody as the one person that identifies this movement and that they can always pull on for, you know, a title or a quote or something that they can just, you know, give as a snapshot that represents the whole, when that's not really the reality. And the other aspect of it is also that every single one of the issues that we see facing our world are also interconnected to the individual, the community, you know. So for example, if we talk about climate is so deeply integrated into class, into politics, into the economy, into every aspect of our lives. And after, I figured that out, cuz my whole like educational development kind of started, yes, with school and the traditional, but it also started with just seeing other people who were in the space and learning from them, which is once again community, but learning from them, and then that inspiring me to learn other things. So when I learned about that interconnectivity with the whole climate movement, I'd looked into social justice, and I looked into, rights for minority groups and underrepresented people, and I realize how interconnected those things are as well. And you said something a little while back as well about how people love to kind of talk about how big, bad, and dangerous the trans movement is, and especially in the media, like for everybody, which obviously is not true. But they don't want to talk about the class issues and the wealth issues and all of these things that are interconnected to social justice as well. And I kind of wanted to pick your brain on that a little bit to see what your thoughts are on that. Those kind of under talked about areas, those areas of social justice that we don't really understand at face value when you look at things, how that interconnection kind of links.
Yeah, I mean, like the if you want a single metric, and obviously it's a reductive point, but if you want a single metric to see how the world is doing, you pick up a graph of
Yeah.
wealth inequality. Like, we know that power isn't exactly wealth, but it very closely correlates with wealth.
Hmm.
And, it's just, oh, wealth inequality is going up, and all of the knock-on effects that has. We are seeing, the inshitification of every industry in the West. Jobs are getting worse. There's a great study done a couple of years back about the kinds of jobs that were created post the financial crash in 2008, which was, the seminal moment for our generation, pretty much. About how, yes, there was an equivalent number of jobs had returned to the economy by 2017, but they
Hmm.
were all lower paid jobs. Like the proportion of, you know, decently middle class earning incomes had collapsed, and it was being replaced by lower paid. And we got the rise of the gig economy and all of these kind of ways to siphon more and more money, and eventually the bottom's going to fall out. You cannot keep eating the apple from the inside until there's no apple left.
Yeah.
And it so much comes back to, I very much the idea that capitalism is the only ill, and that no, there's no social justice issues actually because it's all driven by capitalism. Of course, complete. I'm going to say rubbish. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to swear on this
You
program.
can, that's fine.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely, it's bollocks. There we go. Um, there are social and political facets to all of this, and these are tools used by the establishment and the powers that be that want to maintain their wealth and influence, just as they have done so throughout all of human history. I think that a very seminal one came out because I have to read the news because I'm addicted and this is what I do instead of cocaine. It's probably just about as bad for me, in honesty. Um, and it was about the chancellor having this plan to turn people into investors. They want people to stop putting money in savings accounts and put it into stocks and shares.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, what planet do you live on? Like, what planet is this that my auntie, who's 60 whatever, and is saving up to have some money aside so, to top up her pension. Oh yeah, she's going to be playing the stock market, and she's going to be getting out Robin Hood and being a retail investor. It's like, what
Yeah.
planet are you living on? It's
Yeah.
reinventing Thatcherism for the 21st century, and it's that disconnect. It's that fundamental disconnect because realistically, if you're, a national government at this point, what tools do you have realistically when you are, so bound by this billionaire owned media, when you're owned by, massive donors? Like,
Hmm.
what chance has mainstream political establishment got to actually improve the economic state for their citizens? Because yeah, it's not trans people, it's not immigrants, it's not, whatever other issue is being bandied about in the right wing press today. It's the fact that people can't get a job that pays, a decent living wage. Like, the idea that inflation goes up, real wages go down. How
Yeah.
is that not the fundamental problem? People have less than they did 20 years ago. People have less than they did 5 years ago, and this just keeps getting worse. This gap just keeps increasing. How
Hmm.
is that not the issue? How is that not the fundamental issue at the center of everyone's lives? Is their lives are getting worse. And of course,
Yeah.
people are going to look for answers in that situation. Of course, they're going to say they can see, just as I saw him when I was in my teens, there's something wrong with the world. You go and ask, hey, what's wrong with the world? I was very lucky to have a very clever, very wise individual tell me what was wrong with the world. Other people get, influencers on TikTok who are quite happy to tell them that it's
It's
feminism
scary.
or that it's immigrants. And, there's political movements who will very happily say, oh, I know exactly what's wrong with the world. It's these things, and you should vote for me. And also,
Hmm.
keep giving me money. And, oh, buy my social media service to, have some modicum of connection with human beings because we sold all the libraries and we, privatized all the public parks, and, and kids can't go outside anymore because, we built on all of the playgrounds. It's like, if you want to know what the real issues are, you can look out the window. They're not hard to
Mm.
find.
Yeah. No, you're taking me back to my international relations degree. I remember when I had to read through all of the different intricacies that you kind of summed up there. And oh my God, it's so depressing because it's like you have to just all of these things that you're talking about, and then you look at what's actually being focused on, and it's like, oh my gosh, it's like everyone's asleep, you know? It's just like we're so sucked into. So for example, a few months ago on the podcast we had a guest who is a psychologist and mental health professor, and she was talking about, she coined this term. She probably, I think you you done the same thing earlier, where it's like she coined this term but she also doesn't know she stole it from somebody. But like, basically, what is it, TikTok therapy, I think she said, or TikTok mental health. Yeah, people are getting their information from TikTok, they're getting their information from social media, whatever other platforms there are, and it's shocking, you know. It's, people start voting for people based off of who has a bigger social media presence or who's, you know, more trendy or something like that on social media, and it's just, it can be really really scary to look at. And then there was another thing that I had recently watched. Oh, I can't remember what it is now. It might have been, it wasn't Wolf of Wall Street, but it was something, I think it was The Big Short. Basically, one of those kinds of movies where it's, you know, talking about the stock market and, you know, big man wealth economy, all that stuff. Um and at the end of it, I think it was The Big Short. They were saying, even though this was the core problem, it was greed, and it was, you know, turning a blind eye to the bottom bit of society falling away. It was actually not that. It was actually just the greed that was the problem. And what always gets blamed is, you know, the minorities and the immigrants and the LGBTQ plus community and all these other, you know, people that don't, they're not, they're the victims of the problem along with the rest of society, but they'll always get blamed because people kind of look for someone to blame and they're the easy targets, and it can be kind of really depressing to realize that. What do you think are, and I know this is a huge question, but what do you think are kind of ways to combat against that? Which is, I say it's a huge question because it's kind of asking, how do we change the entire system of how the world is right now? But do you think you have any suggestions?
Fundamentally, it's like you say, they're getting their mental health from TikTok because where else are they going to get it? We're living
Mhm.
in a system, in a social order where mental health care has been cut. People need mental health care, so they're going to go and find it somewhere. And
Yeah.
it's I often liken it to the when the body is starved of minerals and vitamins, it'll soak up whatever it can get hold of, no matter
Mm.
whether it's good for you or not. And fundamentally, it comes back to education. Now, I said earlier about most people don't care about trans people, but it doesn't take many people caring about us to gain major legislative change. It doesn't require many people being concerned about a minority. We've already seen the rights of trans people being rolled back. I hate the term rolled back because it's not like we got them particularly far to begin with, but
Yeah.
they've definitely been worsened. They have been undermined. They have been systemically attacked
Yeah.
in numerous places because, yeah, it only takes a few percent of people. Not even that. We're talking fractions of percents of people
Mhm.
to create political change, and in this case, it is negative political change. It is political change that targets people, that makes their lives actively worse because they think this is going to make their lives magically better. And of course, it's not. We're
Yeah.
fully aware of that because wealth inequality, because of the ownership of media. But for the people who for the 99% in the middle, between the half a percent either side who really care about an issue, it's education. It's the fact that people do kind of need to take a little bit of responsibility and look for information. There are places out there. There are
Mhm.
people doing the good work. There are, so many activists' job is raising awareness. Raising awareness of this cause or that cause is such a essential part to most activism. There are people out there talking with experience and expertise and knowledge on so many different issues, and it's kind of an onus on people to, like you say, understand that just because they're being fed this line of information that that's the correct information just because it comes from the BBC or comes from
Mhm.
the Guardian or whoever else. That, oh well, that must be the correct viewpoint, that must be the correct opinion, um, is going to be fundamentally flawed. It's breaking out of the echo chambers isn't going to, save the world. Breaking out of the echo chambers isn't going to turn around and, solve wealth inequality overnight. But you can't begin to inform people unless they have a way to receive that information, unless they want to learn, unless they want to be curious about the world. And yeah, maybe it is the case of 98% of that 99% aren't interested, and will quite happily stick and stay in their bubble. But if just a few people listening to this podcast, or to any of the other amazing people out there doing the work, trying to educate people, to give people information, to just be curious and talk to people, ask questions, build connections, hear a
Mhm.
different perspective than what you're getting from online billionaire driven sources. Your 60 something auntie isn't, owned by Rupert Murdoch. She might have something interesting to say on the matter. You never know.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe a lot of people's connections will just be, again, secondhand from the media. But go and talk to people that have had experiences. Go to talk to people who've traveled, who've seen places, who've gone and worked in interesting places. All the sorts of people that I'm sure you have on this podcast. Go and talk to people who have seen a little bit of the world that you haven't seen, and hear about it.
Yeah. That was wonderful. Yeah, I think that's actually I was when I asked the question, I was like, how are they gonna answer this? Because I don't even know the answer. If someone asked me that question, I would have no idea how to respond, but I think you've done it in a wonderful, wonderful way. And I really hope that people take that to heart and just be a lot more mindful of where you're getting your information from. Be a lot more mindful of the fact that there are other things out there, and we live in a world of so many people. There's so many people you can go to talk to, even if you think that there aren't. And even if you don't have people that are immediately there that you can go talk to, try and find other sources of information online if you want to, from just beyond what you would typically go to, because there's so many different opinions out there, and there's so many different educational sources out there that are actually quite accessible. And sometimes it can just be your family members, your friends, your colleagues, whoever else it is you have access to. um and yeah, with that, Abby, I'm going to lead you into your last words for the podcast. Any last words you have to say to our audience today?
Oh, the pressure's on now. I think, yeah, I always try and make sure that whatever message of warning that one gives, and I've given a couple in this episode, yeah, we've talked about the climate, we've talked about the wealth inequality, we've talked about the rising political issues, we've talked about the rise of the right wing and hatred, and all of that is there, all of that is real. And I'm going to take a wild guess and say, again, I've said, I'm probably going to have to take a drink every time I've said the word 99% during this episode, but the 99% of people listening to this sort of podcast, I'm sure, are exceptionally aware of all of those issues. But all of the warnings need to be tempered with a message of hope.
Yeah.
And it's so much part of activism. I'll go back to the quote we had at the start. We're beginning to understand that the world is always being made fresh and never finished. Is that part of that never being finished is it's never going to be ended either. There's never going,
Hmm.
the right wing is never going to win. The backwardsness is never going to be the final word. Even if it's on the rise, even if it's growing, everything will change one day.
Hmm.
And I truly believe that one day things will change for the better.
I found that very reassuring for myself as well. So thank you. Abby, it's been such a joy to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for joining and talking with me. It's honestly been a really so many things: educational, inspirational, like reassuring, all of those things, all of those good buzzwords is how I felt today. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Is How can people find you or find who you work for, all of these things, where do you want people to go kind of digging a bit to learn more about you?
As far as people learning about me, God, that's terrifying. I'm just some idiot. As to
No.
the work I do, that's a different thing every other week. My main role currently is in Manchester in trans activism. I'm the secretary of Transmutual Aid Manchester, which can be found on our link tree at transmcr, or just Trans Manchester into Google will almost certainly come up with us. There's a whole network of organisations in Manchester. It's a wonderfully queer city. But beyond that, as far as people want to find me, you'll find me by finding people who want to make the world a better place. And there's no shortage of those around. They're pretty easy to find.
Lovely. Wonderful. And I will link the Transmutual Aid information in the show notes so you guys can go check that organization out because that's actually where we found Abbie as well, and got to have this conversation today. So, yeah, with that, I think that's all we've got for you guys today. Thank you so much for listening. And please tune back into the Notes and Quotes podcast next Tuesday. And if you want more of us, you can find us on Instagram, LinkedIn, TikTok, or YouTube. We're kind of everywhere. So, yeah, go follow the podcast and see what we're talking about next week. Okay, that's it. Bye.